American youth is the most copied human being in the world. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Uber Cordero Show. If you haven't subscribed, please do. And also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at the Uber Cordero Show. Now, this week, I wanted to talk about why there is a friction between Africans and African Americans. This is a topical issue in America right now, and I just wanted to talk about it. Professor Small was asked why Africans are not involved in Black Lives Matter protests and other community engagements in New York. And he had this to say.
Let me tell you something. We think slavery in America was something. Slavery in Africa is still in force. You talking about deaf, blind, and dumb. Don't confuse you because somebody got on some printed cloth that's printed in Holland or India that you're looking at an African cultural expression. That's not an African cultural expression. That cloth was printed in a European country and then sold to Africans. And they've accepted that as their cloth. You understand what I'm saying? Just that piece. Now, they do speak the language, but they know less about their history than you and I do. So you've got a deaf, blind, dumb, backwards person speaking an African language, coming from the African country, came here to be a parasite on their own people with no respect for themselves as human beings. And
I want to respond to what Professor Small said, because I think it's wrong and rude to use this Trumpian and racist logic against fellow Black who are facing multiple challenges. And I also want to use this chance to highlight differences of Black experiences to argue that the assumption that Africans and African Americans look down on each other is true, but it is based on an ignorance and should be expelled and refuted just as racism should be. So I'm doubling down on my anti-racist logic, which I borrow from Kendi Ibrahim, to refute and take down these responses, even though I have so much respect for Professor James Small and whatever he does. I just think his rhetoric was just so racist to use the word primitive and to use the word parasite describing people of color who happen to be from another continent. In order to respond to that, I went back to the themes of this show. One of them is to educate the masses, the public, by taking out theory out of the classroom and making it understandable for everybody. And I just felt like I am compelled to respond to this. And I'm going to do that by giving an understanding of geographical dimension of Blackness. I'm going to talk about different types of the Black experience and what geographical factors led them to be as they are. And I'm going to talk about the Middle Atlantic Blackness, which refers to the crossing of the Atlantic, mainly influenced by slavery. They were sentenced lifelong slavery until 1865 through when the 13th Amendment was made in the U.S. Constitution, freeing African American slaves on June 19th, 1865, what we now call the Juneteenth celebration, which are important. You should be celebrating it. And also in the Middle Atlantic Blackness, there is the Latin American slavery. Here we're talking about a bunch of Latin American countries, including Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and many other countries. I just mentioned the major countries. And here their experience is also different from us, from the North American experience, because in Latin America, there was a lot less number of white females that these enslavers, mostly Portuguese and Spanish, could engage with. So they ended up mixing up, especially in Brazil. Slave women be married to white male from Spain or Portugal. So in Brazil, you find a mixed race society that is embracing that, but relegating the place of Blackness as a lower level. And many people in Brazil do not identify as Black, even though they might be Black. But obviously, there is a big influence of African culture in Brazil, and 50% of Brazilians have Black blood. Argentina murdered most of the Black people who were there, and Mexico also has a Black population, particularly in southern areas. Lastly, in the Caribbean slavery, which is also important in the Middle Atlantic group because of how slaves in the Caribbean were treated. There's a study which was done, which excavated bonds of slaves and showed how they died and incredible stress on their bonds because of the amount of work they had to live. It said in sometimes males lived up to 3 months because of excessive labor, which was causing so much strain on their body. So it was very brutal form of slavery and very profit motivated. There's also Indian endangered servitude. That is, Indian people brought out of British colonialism from the Indian subcontinent to the Caribbean islands. So these endangered servants also mixed up with African slaves, later on joined by the Chinese who were building railroad in the Caribbean. So now we have this mixed group of people found themselves in this quagmire because of colonialism, slavery, and forces of imperialism. So when you understand Atlantic slavery, you have to understand it in these three distinct ways. So within the African Americans angle, I look at it in the North American form of slavery. Obviously, in the last 20 years, there's been a lot of mixing up of people, black people from all over the world coming into the United States and complicating what we define as African American. The black American experience in the United States is the most predominant one because of the position of the United States in global politics. So when we talk about blackness, there's always the assumption that it is an American experience. But we should not forget the experience of the people in the Caribbean and in Latin America as also affected by what we call the Middle Passage. And Black American experience is also not monolithic. As all societies, they are as diverse as they come. But the identity springs from what was then called the one-tenth rule, also called the pencil test. And one-tenth rule was an effort of broadening slavery for economic purposes and for defeating invisible blackness. So when you say one-tenth rule, you mean if an individual had only a tenth of blackness in him, maybe great-great-great-grandfather was black, and it became manifest in his body features, then he will define black. Mostly it sprang out of an economic imperative that if black people were mixing up with white people through rape or consensual sexual relations, and the population of black people multiplied, then there won't be any slaves. So from the standpoint of slave owners, and later on Jim Crow laws, it will be paramount to limit as much as possible the access to what we call whiteness. And invisible blackness is black people that are racially ambiguous, that you couldn't really tell. And slave masters and eventual segregationists weren't really in favor of this. So today, to be an African American is to choose to identify with a culture that has origins in Africa, either through ancestry or through some ways of life. And whether one is of mixed or heritage or as ambiguous racial features, that does not matter. It just matters you have to identify with this culture. So for some people who are phenotypically black, it's a non-issue. It's automatically an assumption. But for those who can pass, it becomes a personal discretion. Some people choose it depending on how they raised. Some people do not choose it. But that's just the tip of the issue. Let's go further. Another slavery which was happening in Africa is called the trans-Saharan slave trade. And in this case, we're talking about slave traders from North Africa coming to capture African people and selling them to Arabs from North Africa or from the Middle East. A country like Saudi Arabia has almost 10% black population, but we usually don't know about that. There are also black people in Iran, black people everywhere. So slavery between Africans and Arab is a thing, and it happened, and the influence is in places like Zanzibar, which literally means land of the stupids. Zenji is a Swahili word which the Arabs used to use for people who are non-religious or stupid. So Zenji, land of the blacks because they don't know anything. So it's also racialized, as you can see, but the dynamics are complicated, and we can expand on that a little more. But what I'm getting to here is that there's a common denominator. No black person escaped the scourge of blackness. It was experienced differently, but the impact is equally the same. Geographical dislocation and relative influence of the countries that emerged out of this complicated context mattered. So slaves that found themselves in the United States and their descendants were in a platform that they could leverage cultural power and influence. So right now, you see, the African American youth is the most copied human being in the world because of obviously the influence of America, and secondly, the privileged position vis-a-vis other things going on in America that are horrible. The African American is always on the screen. So that is the theoretical background. And I want to move a little bit to how Africans now come to the United States. Now, there's the Civil Rights in 1965 and the Refugee Act of 1980, and later on, the Immigration Act of 1990. These are pivotal legislations and or laws which made it possible for Africans to come to the United States. Now, we've understood the context and the histories of different black people in different places. Now, let's talk about how Africans end up in the United States after slavery. And I'm going to highlight three important things that happened. The Civil Rights Act, 1964. The Refugee Act, 1980. The Immigration Act, 1990. These are U.S. acts that allowed people from different parts of the world to come here, benefiting off the works of African American people who marched for years to make it allowable that people of all races could enjoy the privilege of being an American. And among those things is the inclusion of black people from all over the world and other people of color to come, go to U.S. universities, work as nurses. So if anybody is disrespecting African Americans, it's wrong because they do not understand that the only reason they are in the United States is because somebody was marching in Selma. Somebody was being hauled by dogs. Somebody was going to jail so that they could come to the United States. This is an important point, and I want everybody to understand it. Without African Americans and without the civil rights, neither me or any other Indian guy working in California in Silicon Valley could be here. So we should be grateful for that. Secondly, the struggle against Jim Crow in the South and the struggle against colonialism in Africa went hand in hand. Later on, a lot of black people started attending colleges in the U.S., first from Liberia and later on from other places in Africa, especially Kenya. One of those people who came in those efforts is Barack Obama Sr., the father to President Barack Obama. So African Americans supported these movements. Some of them donated scholarships to bring Africans here to study. There were also efforts and money contribution to fight for independence in Africa, and especially in South Africa. Mandela was a big celebrity here. So there was a lot of brotherly love coming from the stateside, and there was also a lot of brotherly love coming from Africa. African people like Tom Mboya, friends to Barack Obama Sr., was speaking at civil rights rallies in the USA. But because of the Civil Rights Act, which was a product of all these movements, Africans could now study and stay in the USA. But it was a specific kind of African, the African elite. It was the Africans who were sons of chiefs, who had gone to college, who had means and resources to do things that ordinary Africans wouldn't do. So there is a stereotype in African Americans that when you see an African, he's probably a prince, son of a chief, or somebody important. This stereotype comes out of the context of these people's contact. And it's that the first Africans in the United States were usually this kind of people. Then comes the 1980 Refugee Act, which opens the path for African refugees to settle in the USA. Also other people from other areas. It was signed by Jimmy Carter. And from this, refugees from other places that were conflictious, like Somalia, Congo, and many other places started coming to the US. And this was a different breed of Africans. Many of them were educated, but there are also a substantial amount of them who did not have the means as their elites who had come in the 1960s. The 1990 Immigration Act, a pathway for U.S. citizenship and U.S. residency is created called the green card. lottery. And the green card lottery opened the way for many millions of Africans to come to the United States and share space with African Americans. Now, it is in this context that different understanding started to emerge about what blackness means. What blackness as in African American, blackness as in African. What is it? And it is these conversations about what it means to be African American or Black American that have come to the fore and highlighted by people like Professor Small and many other nationalist, misinformed people who are trying to reduce blackness to be a monolithic event without context and without understanding that Black Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter everywhere in the globe. And it is our duty to protect our rights and to embrace ourselves as people and to create a pathway for other people to join us in this movement. And we are not going to create this movement if other people are segregating within on the basis of color, on the basis of nationality, of religion, of professional qualification. It is our duty as Black people to stay united and to attract other people to bless us. Thank you. Join us again next week for another episode. I hope this was educative. If you like what I'm presenting here and you want to support me, please subscribe to my channel. The links are below. You can also follow me at Cordero Uber on Twitter. You can also like the Uber Cordero Show on Facebook as well as on Instagram. Thank you, gentlemen. Stay united, stay safe, and meet you next week.